Hey guys, and thank you for joining us today for Cyber Talk with me, Julia Lee, Senior Manager of the Cyber Center of Excellence within the Cybersecurity Division at the Ontario Public Service. The theme for our episode today is the importance of privacy, governance, and digital security. And in our world today, we have access to more information than really ever before, and especially with the evolution of the internet and the advancements of artificial intelligence. People have data at the tips of their fingers literally 24/7. And because of this ever changing phenomenon, we really need to look into protecting our data and ensuring that there is still privacy in our lives, which is why we have brought on a very special guest today who have tons of experience in this field to talk to us today. Our guest today is someone was privileged to work closely with for several years. And fun fact, John was actually one of our very first guests on the Cyber Talk show. So as he has been with us since the very beginning, I am so happy to have him back with us today. When you were on the very first episode there, John, you were formerly the acting CISO at the Ministry of Public and Business Service Delivery and Archivist of Ontario. Now, John moves on as our Associate Deputy Minister with Ontario's Ministry of Public and Business Service Delivery and the province's Chief Privacy Officer, Archivist of Ontario, and Deputy Chief Digital and Data Officer. So basically, if you want a definition of a person who does it all, it's John Roberts, with over 30 years of experience ranging from operational, policy, and senior leadership roles to government information management and digital government initiatives. He's got an extensive knowledge in information management, privacy, and of course, cybersecurity. And with that, John, welcome back to the Cyber Talk show.
Thanks, Julia. It's a pleasure to be back, and apologies, everyone. I think my job title is one of the most extended and cumbersome in government. We really need to figure out how to shorten that down somehow. But great to be back and talking privacy and security.
Thanks, John, and thanks for taking the time to join us today. And at this point here, I know there's a few questions that we've queued up today, and there's always a few questions from our audience. So let's jump right into our questions. My first question for you is, privacy and data security, it must be part of the conversation, of course, when utilizing new technology. But really, what is your take on the relationship between data privacy and cybersecurity? Any predictions around privacy, and how do you see the future of digital security overall?
That's a great question. We could probably talk for the rest of the hour just about some of the relationships between privacy and security, because I guess right off the top, I'd note that while clearly, as you've highlighted in the question, there's a close relationship between the two, it's also quite striking how they also operate in many organizations in a quite disconnected way. You know, the cybersecurity has got its roots often in technical practice, is typically aligned with the IT organization and is very much in the technology space. Privacy in many organizations is more closely aligned to legal and regulatory compliance type activity, which I think is actually more a reflection of the fact that privacy has been more legislated than cybersecurity when you look back over the last 30 or 40 years. But there's absolutely a massive overlap. It was before I was acting CISO as Chief Privacy Officer, it was clear to me that there was a huge need to work closely with cyber colleagues, because the reality is that a lot of the cybersecurity incidents that we face in any organization are actually motivated by the threat actors seeking out personal information. Personal information is comparatively easy to monetize if you're one of the bad guys, and therefore it's often targeted. As a result of that, a lot of the cyber incidents that we deal with do also involve privacy breaches. So just in a straight kind of two worlds colliding and needing to work together, these processes often are very much related to some of the same practices on the ground. But if you step back from that a little bit and think about how the programs need to work together and some of the opportunities, then you see that at pretty much every point in the operating model. The idea of privacy by design and security by design start right up front with some of the very related analysis around what kind of data are we trying to collect and how sensitive is it and how is it being managed, and ensuring that we've got a really deliberate and intentional approach rather than simply looking to see what a program has done and then trying to protect it after the fact. Privacy after the fact is just as flawed as security after the fact. So real interest in getting some aligned design, some aligned risk and sensitivity thinking up front. A second area where the two programs need to collaborate very strongly is in terms of education and training for our staff. We often talk about people as one of the greatest risk vectors in cyber, and similarly, it's people that are often at the heart of privacy concerns and privacy incidents. And in practice, we know from talking to our staff that the issues that they're dealing with, the practices we're asking them to take on board, the behaviors really feel very, very closely related. So I think it's no surprise that in more mature organizations, we tend to see privacy and security training and education tightly coupled, so that we're building that awareness of information risk, building information literacy, getting people to actually think about the potential misuse of the data that they're handling as part of their day-to-day practice. A third area then is the increasing importance of understanding the risks that our vendor partners bring into the mix, and how they're participating in the same way that we want to understand how they are managing security and not introducing vulnerabilities into a solution space, understanding how vendor staff are trained to appreciate privacy, to make sure that they are being responsible in any handling of personal information is equally critical. And finally, in terms of some of that alignment and integration between the two worlds, back to my early comment about breach response. There are some different things that we need to do in terms of treating a cyber incident and treating a privacy breach. If we forget the whole of those practices, then we'll miss some tricks. If there is a cyber incident that has compromised some personal information, there's a bunch of privacy practices that are required around notification to affected individuals, potentially engaging privacy regulators and watchdogs that need to be woven into the approach, as well as the technical cyber response activity. So all sorts of stuff that is coming together and really drives the importance of a close relationship between privacy professionals and cybersecurity professionals. The other thing I think you threw into the question there is just kind of a little hook at the tail was around predictions for the future. And this is a really interesting one, because particularly on the privacy side of the equation, I think we're seeing a real evolution of what privacy means. It's a value that people hold very dear, but it's already evolved in terms of what most people think of as kind of a privacy concern. Back in the day, it was very much around the wrong people accessing personally identifiable information, kind of those old school breaches. But increasingly, we find people concerned about the ability to actually exercise control over their personal information, which takes you to things like the right to take your information from one vendor to someone else and get that sort of data portability. We hear lots of people invoking privacy in questions of algorithmic bias and whether their personal information is being used in AI contexts to create systems that are discriminating or are acting against them. We hear people who are concerned about even their de-identified information being used in ways that they are not comfortable with, and asserting that as a kind of privacy invasion. So it's becoming an increasingly slippery term. And again, I think in that kind of slipperiness becomes more and more bound up with security, which I think is also kind of stretching and evolving a bit. So what we are seeing, I think, is more and more privacy and cybersecurity both being positioned with an umbrella terminology like digital trust and digital resilience, and being embedded in some of those broader narratives, because the traditional sort of narrow definitions don't quite work. So we're seeing stuff evolve. One area I'm not going to make a prediction on, though, is just where some of the emerging or sort of generative AI technologies go. We're already seeing lots of chatter about the potential cyber risks and the potential privacy implications of ChatGPT and its competitors. I'm sure that there are going to be pieces. Seen the Italian privacy commissioner uh, take action against ChatGPT based on concerns about where some of the training data is coming from and the extent to which all appropriate consent and disclosure processes were involved there. So there's some interesting scenarios that are already starting to arise as regulators look to the impacts of some of these new models, and how traditional concepts of privacy and cybersecurity operate in those new spaces. But the one thing I've seen just even in the last few months is how rapidly that space is evolving, which certainly scares me off making any hard and fast predictions about where it's going to go, other than we need to be watching and really reflecting on what those technologies involve, how they affect folk, and what we need to do as responsible public servants to ensure that the kind of evolving and new concepts of privacy and security are really applied into some novel business models.
That's a very interesting take, John. And I'm just wondering, in terms of what you're seeing across the public sector, talking a little bit more about the private sector here, in terms of that alignment, the predictions that you've just laid out, is that something that we'll see maybe in the next year or so with private sector organizations?
I think the issues apply equally in the private sector, to be honest. I think sometimes we think of privacy as having a distinctive character in government. Personally, I don't think that's true, because privacy really, certainly for Canadians and indeed in many jurisdictions, is not just a product of kind of contract law and agreements made with third parties. It comes back to a deeper seated sense of values and who we are. And in Canadian legal contexts, that's why the privacy rights typically derive back to fundamental charter rights. That's why in Europe, the whole basis of GDPR and the European privacy regime goes back to the fundamental principles of respect for the individual. So when we're talking about privacy, and by implication, the security of personal information, really we're talking about stuff that is quite deeply seated values of individuals. And those are values that arise whether they're dealing with private corporations or with the broader public sector, with municipalities, or with central government institutions. So no, I don't think any organization can ignore the fundamental importance of privacy for its relationship with customers and indeed with its own staff. Equally, it can't ignore the fact that those concepts of privacy, and therefore what is acceptable for citizens and for the public, is evolving and changing. So if you really anchor yourself just in historic views, you will get caught out. Again, perhaps related to that, one of the things I have as a bit of a mantra around privacy is actually, despite the fact it's often located in a regulatory compliance setting, it is incredibly short-sighted and self-defeating even to think of privacy purely as a compliance task. In a government setting, I often say we don't do privacy just because we have obligations in Ontario and FIPA, or Privacy Act if you're federal, or pick your legislation of choice. We actually do privacy and pay attention to it because it's what our publics expect. They expect it of a public service, that it is going to be respectful of their values, their expectations of having their information carefully managed to avoid being exposed and subject to a range of harms. And I think that's similar in the private sector. Clients expect a level of care and stewardship of personal information. The the amazingly rich and complex toolkits from cybersecurity professionals are part of how we meet those expectations by having the skills and the monitoring systems and the protections to ensure that the technology enabled systems are actually protected and secure. Because when we talk about personal information, again, these days, the vast majority of personal information that is held by any organization is held in digital form on IT systems. There are still paper files around and analog information, but the reality is the vast majority is digital and is protected through the practices of cybersecurity professionals.
That's an excellent take there, John. And that was a lot of information in terms of your predictions, talking about the relationship between cybersecurity and privacy here in terms of the top here. I can't emphasize this enough as part of our daily work as well as through education and training among staff, the importance of really understanding the risk of vendor partners and our breach response, right? And I really like the part that you said, like, don't do it afterwards, do it before. So prevention is always key within cybersecurity or within the privacy world.
Absolutely. And that's that intentional design of the systems, even basic principles like data minimization to create a small target. If you don't need data, why would you be collecting it? So being clear, that helps you both manage risk. It also helps some of the communications to the public about being really clear what's being collected and why, and having that active engagement to reassure clients, public, etc., about the justification for collecting information. Because a lot of privacy concerns come back to why are you collecting this? What are you doing with it? What can happen with it? And if you can't answer those questions, and quite frankly, why are you collecting it? You're just creating risk.
Absolutely. And just moving to the other side of things, I think it's quite interesting that people may think that there's that divide between data privacy and cybersecurity, right? But really, we all know it goes hand in hand. But for others, I hear, privacy is vastly different from cybersecurity. But our work in cybersecurity, as we know, is protecting sensitive data, ensuring that threat actors don't get a hold of our information that's valuable to us, especially the government side, where we're pretty much a treasure chest of data for hackers out there. But that also means that ensuring that people keep their information private and individuals, organizations, or governments, that we have those processes in place, just to kind of echo your point there. But I think I mentioned in the beginning that we are at a time where technology really is at its peak, right there in advancements of AI, especially these days, and so on. And a lot of times we may see technology really as a threat, as it allows for those threat actors to really easily create compelling phishing emails, trying to get ahead of the game. So that is actually one of the work that we do here, as well as our corporate phishing campaigns. How do we kind of get ahead of it without just the obvious spelling and grammar mistakes or other tactics to really gain access to information they want? But however, on the flip side, we also need to know that, technology is there for us to our benefit, and it also has its advantages. My next question for you here, John, is how can we really use technology to enhance privacy and digital security?
Again, I think there are a lot of obvious opportunities. Yes, there are risks, as you highlight. That the way in which information can be used for phishing and kind of targeted social engineering type attacks. But I think a couple of things I'd call out on the technology side to protect personal information is firstly just the sophistication of some of our monitoring tools. And again, I think this is probably bread and butter for most folk on the call. But the ability to monitor our environments, our networks, understand what information is flowing where, and whether that's expected behavior or unexpected behavior, to understand and protect against exfiltration, against kind of unexpected patterns of use is a really good way of using kind of the vast processing power that we have in our technology systems these days to protect stuff. it's clear that, and we were talking before about, you don't just want to protect after the fact. Technology or privacy approaches that simply try to put a really big fence around crown jewels is not the way to go. It needs to be a more sophisticated approach. And some of those pieces around the monitoring of behavior in our environments helps ensure that secure, sensitive data is kept secure and protected. Second line of, I guess, technology work that I think is hugely important in that crossover zone between cybersecurity in general and privacy protection is the whole space around identity management and authentication systems and the like. Privacy really, in one of the definitions, is the wrong people accessing personal information. And you're there immediately into the space of, well, who is accessing what, and the ability to control the various actors within the system through appropriate identity type practices. More expansively, that also starts to get into approaches that allow virtualization of identity from data, so you can fragment the data structures, the use of self-sovereign identities and identity credentials to create more resilience. Lots of really interesting stuff happening in the identity management space, which in part because it is so focused on personal information, has got a particularly close connection to how privacy and the right actors doing the right things manifest in a system. Another, perhaps a final area that I'd note is just the all the interesting work around de-identification and anonymization, and some of the fascinating stuff emerging in the world of big data around practices that enable genuine anonymization of data assets. So the ability to extract value from information without compromising privacy through more sophisticated practices for linking and de-identifying, but in sort of end-to-end anonymous ways. The understanding of how to use salted data sets to prevent re-identification and de-anonymization of individuals. Lots of great stuff again happening in technical ways that enable us to continue to get value whilst also being able to have strong de-identification of the underlying data. So I know there's a bit of a perception that privacy practices tend to be far less technical than cybersecurity, but there are certainly aspects of privacy research that go quite deeply into understandings of computing practice and the technical data structures and so on, and that are being unpacked by privacy researchers to understand how to genuinely protect privacy. That's before you get into all the fancy stuff about tracking people on the web and kind of embedded tokens and some of the funky stuff there, and the way we need to use some sophisticated technical screening tools to address those kinds of practices.
That's a very interesting take, and I like how you talked about, how we can really benefit from the advancements of technologies through monitoring behavior to know what's normal, what's not normal, to identity management and authentication, to valuing our data, big data, ability for us to now leverage and extract value for the organization or from the organization itself.
So I think we do need to be really careful not to set up privacy as something that is going to prevent us from using information well. Again, it's one of those false dichotomies that I sometimes strike. People feel that the privacy practices are inherently problematic in terms of being able to have data-led innovation or to generate analytics and insights from data. So to my mind, that's simply a matter of not fully working through the opportunities and the problem space. There are plenty of tools, plenty of governance practices that do enable us to have both good privacy practice and still be really generating good data supports for decision making and the like. It's often assumptions that you need the full identified data to be part of the analytics side is just sloppy thinking in my mind. And it's there are ways to address these challenges. So I fundamentally push back if anyone says that privacy is a limitation on effective use of data in an organization. I think it's the sort of analysis that you need to drive good privacy protection is actually the sort of analysis you should be expecting to have a really mature insights and analytics shop. It's really understanding your data and getting into the nuances rather than just making crude assumptions.
Absolutely. And it's kind of interesting just to see in your role, especially playing both hats as a leader within cybersecurity and within the digital space and privacy here, if any myths kind of there along the way there, John. I know you talked about one where, people think that privacy is not as technical as cybersecurity, the importance of data and the relationship between the two. But any other myths that you've had to dispel along the way?
Well, I think I've touched on a couple already. There's certainly a myth that privacy matters in government because of something distinctive about the citizen state reaction that is not important to private business. And I think private industry is just as invested in reputation and in social license and meeting the expectations of its clients, particularly as you go into more digital businesses. The organizations are very much judged on how well they meet client expectations, in part around data protection. So that's certainly one myth. And then the one we were just talking about, that privacy practice is somehow restrictive of innovation or limiting to innovation. And again, part of what I have seen in government and heard from private sector partners is actually exactly the opposite, that being responsible in terms of privacy helps create the preconditions where people can be confident about innovating and can do so in a way that is accepted and understood by the public at large. So having that an environment, an ecosystem where there are clear, well understood expectations about what privacy means, the principles that should be driving decision making, and evidence that that is well enforced and that there is oversight and the like, can actually create the environment where people are more accepting and prepared to allow organizations to innovate. One of the biggest barriers that I hear from the private sector around sort of data innovation is a concern that what they do might be seen as somehow playing fast and loose with people's personal information. Whereas if you have a well-articulated and transparent privacy regime that has broad public acceptance, it creates that clarity about where the guardrails are within which organizations can indeed compete. And the ability for individuals to control their data, again, enables a more competitive level playing field environment, rather than organizations being successful purely because they have vacuumed up more personal information than their rivals. So that clearly is the underpinning logic of initiatives like open banking and a number of other pieces to avoid lock-in by empowering people to have control of their data, which is one of the aims of most privacy frameworks, is to create that sense of personal. But a byproduct that is or isn't privacy, depending on how you frame things, is around that ability to have competition based on quality of services rather than just size of data resources.
Absolutely. I'm going to step in before we head to our next question here. I know that there's a few viewers here that's dropping their questions into the chat. Please continue to do so. We will make sure we leave time today to answer and get to your questions for our Q&A segment. But John, really bringing back to one of your many roles, and I see some questions here from our audience today interested in terms of a day in your life, but is really looking in terms of good data governance within Ontario. And I know you talked about this in terms of the key principles that we need to kind of maintain. But is there anything else you'd like to kind of share when it comes to key principles of good data governance for our audience today?
Okay, so I guess some of the things that I would touch on in terms of data governance, really understanding the data and how it relates to business. So know what data an organization has, where it is, why it's being collected, what terms and conditions, and in a privacy sense, what consents, etc., apply to it. So a whole set of kind of foundational practices around actually understanding your data holdings and their origins and provenance. Related to that, and again, in that point where our Venn diagram of privacy and security overlap, is around understanding the sensitivity of that data. Partly, data governance does require an organization to understand the risk associated with certain management practices or uses of data, which requires a level of understanding about how sensitive it is and to whom and for what purposes. Exactly the sort of assessment and lens that either a privacy professional or a cybersecurity professional would be applying. So then beyond that, if you can't understand that landscape, the other big facet of data governance is clarity about the decision rights and rules. So who actually gets to make what decisions about the data, again, so that is clear and can be managed. And that could be decisions about its release, its use. It could be about its collection and disclosure. It could be decisions about certain formats and standards. But to drive good data governance, there's both the foundational understanding and then the clarity about the decision rights and the rule setting. And then perhaps the final piece, given that when we talk data governance in government and in larger organizations, we're typically talking about the challenges of data governance at an enterprise level. There is some real importance in thinking about the value of data beyond its original context. And this is one where privacy professionals get really involved, because the traditional principle of privacy is that information, personal information at least, should only be used in the specific context for which it was created. Then you don't get that sense of unease from data subjects, from citizens, about their data being used in different ways. It's collected on one purpose, used for that purpose, and kept that way. But for enterprise data governance, we do need to be thinking about what is the value of data in other parts of the broader organization, avoiding those kind of multiple sources of the truth and getting towards being able to apply more of a master data management type approach, understanding under what conditions can data collected in one place be used elsewhere? To what extent does it need any de-identification to be reused? So that kind of collective vision, as opposed to just the program by program or product by product vision, is again, I'd say, a key pillar of good data governance. Finally, I'd perhaps just on a bit of a tangent. I heard you say something about a day in the life of for me. Data governance crops up almost every day for me, because it is understanding how do we use data right across the public sector. How do we avoid some of these perceived conflicts between privacy protection and data value generation? How do we implement data governance at scale in ways that builds social license and confidence in our public, rather than causing them agitation and concern perceptions of privacy misuse? How does our analysis of the data landscape at scale inform the ways in which we need to evolve privacy policies and practices? How do we need to re-articulate underlying principles in ways that allow for different implementation models, but still honouring fundamental expectations around the information handling and protection? And that does lead me to frequent conversations with cybersecurity colleagues about how that that stuff is playing through in practice, whether it's questions about what are our most critical data assets, whether it's questions about how we understanding the resilience of the system, what's the right balance between single source of the truth, but to distributed data for resilience. Lots of stuff that comes out of data governance conversations that tracks not just to privacy uplift, but also to the importance of a cybersecurity perspective in a data governance ecosystem.
That's right. And you're ahead of the game there, Jenna. My question was going to be like, with your vast array of roles that you play here within the government, what are the few things that you actually champion for? So thanks for sharing that take. But as you know, in terms of one of the recommendations as we built the Ontario Cybersecurity Expert Panel was around governance and Ontario's operating model. And the challenge that the expert panel identified, which is actually highlighted at cybersecurityontario.ca, and the final report can be found there, identified was that there was that disparity between policies, the procedures, accountabilities amongst BPS or broader public sector governance structures when it comes to cybersecurity. They've identified that there were no clear rules and regulations for BPS organizations, where there were limited resources that suffer those consequences. So taking into account what John had further said, understanding that foundational practices of data being held and collected is of most importance, understanding the data of risks, and clarity on the decision and rights of your data. And then I think lastly there, to sum it up, is really the importance to think of the value of data beyond its specific content in which it was intended or it was created for. But on this note here, John, my next question for you is around the different policy and processes in place around privacy. So when it comes to security, we often look at the tools and the products to enhance our posture. But is privacy more about policy and processes?
I think this is another one of those myths that we were talking about earlier, Julia. And I think, yes, I know from firsthand experience that there is a lot of cybersecurity work that does go back to the specific tools and products and kind of technology solutions at play. And yes, there is a lot in the privacy world that is about the policies and the regulations and the practices, but that's not actually setting up that opposition that I think was hinted at in the question. Because equally, you can say cybersecurity is also dependent on good practices, on good analysis. Right. I mean, all the sort of the threat risk assessment, that stuff is practice. All of the policies and standards that underpin the cyber ecosystem, that underpin the selection and procurement of tools, that's process policy stuff, and it's really important in the cyberspace. And equally, as we were talking about a little bit earlier on the hour, there are lots of technical tools that can be very supportive of privacy protection. Whenever the personal information is managed in a technical sense, you need to understand some of the tools, what they are doing, who has access rights to which pieces, to really be able to have privacy protection in depth. So I think that perception that privacy is far more about policy and practice, and cybersecurity is far more about tools and products, I think actually comes back to the comment I think I made right at the top, that historically, that those tend to be the organizational contexts in which those functions have evolved. Cybersecurity typically in an IT environment where there is more conversation around the tools and technologies and products, and in part because it has been specified in legislation far more for a longer time than cybersecurity obligations have. Privacy is typically more closely linked into organizational settings where regulation and policy and kind of compliance monitoring are dominant. But I think that's absolutely not the whole of the picture, and it's not a necessity. I think actually the both functions are far more effective when they understand there is more to cybersecurity than just buying the latest security tools from vendor of choice. I don't think anyone would think that they could just go to a trade fair, pick the booth that impresses them most, and buy an appliance and plug it in, and security is done. All the education and training and pieces that your team do need to complement sophisticated tools. And it would be equally naive for any organization to think that writing a really good privacy policy is all that's needed to really address that side of the equation. Again, it needs instantiation, it needs operationalization, which takes you straight into the technology space.
Excellent. I'm just being mindful of the time now, and I think, John, to your point at the very beginning, we definitely need more than an hour to talk about, everything around privacy and cybersecurity. But since you've been on since the first episode there, John, there's been a lot of students that's been coming on board too and taking advantage of our shows. And this show is actually featured in some lectures as well. So it's really showing that there's lots of, really useful information that's shared out from our special guests. So I'll just move right on to our last question that I asked to all my guests is, what is the best cybersecurity advice you can give or have ever received?
I think the best cybersecurity advice that I've received, I can't remember who it was from. It may have even been you, Julia, but that simple message that cybersecurity is a team sport. It's not something that is just done by a cyber ops team or a CISO. It's an exercise that needs to involve a range of practitioners across the organization. And one of the areas that should be contributing to that cybersecurity team in a broad sense is the privacy function. So to link it back to the topic today, but that reminder that when it comes to protecting information and delivering top quality cybersecurity for any organization, it's more than just the cyber professionals who need to be involved. It's the auditors, it's the governance leaders, it's the risk function, it's the privacy function, it's the information management function, it's the infrastructure function. To some extent, it's the procurement function in terms of who else is being linked into the environment. It's the onboarding teams. It's definitely a full court press if we really want to be delivering cyber secure organizations. So long-winded way, but that core message that this is a team sport, I think, has stuck with me and continues to resonate as I engage with cybersecurity from all sorts of different angles.
That's awesome. That's some really great advice there, John, that you have received. I'm not going to take any credit for that, but that's fantastic to share. Now, moving on to our favorite part of the session is our Q&A session. I know there's a lot of questions here targeted for John, so we'll start off with the first question here. I am curious if the speakers know of any useful privacy training courses. Does the province offer any?
So we do have some privacy training blended in with some of our cybersecurity offerings. Again, back to that point about not having an unnecessary distinction between them. There are some additional privacy resources available on our websites, I think more targeted to provincial public servants than to the world outside. But there are the other place that I'd say for more general audiences, the Ontario Information and Privacy Commissioner has some great privacy resources, including some really accessible material that's designed for children to start instilling that awareness of how behavior, even for children, can affect the ability to protect one's privacy. So as well as sort of the stuff that we do within the provincial government, our regulators and watchdogs also take a view that part of their responsibility, part of the way that they will keep people safe, is not just by monitoring compliance, but also building an informed ecosystem. So I'd suggest that the IPC website, and indeed the Federal Privacy Commissioner for broader stuff, those watchdogs do tend to put out resources that go far beyond just driving compliance with that particular legislation, and start to help people understand what privacy means.
Excellent. All right, our next question is from our friend Ali here. Does the province engage with other countries around privacy best practices and so forth?
Absolutely, because these are issues that are not unique to Ontario. The concern about maintaining privacy in a digital age is pretty much global, even though there are some differences between countries and between cultures about how significant privacy as a value is. But we engage both across Canada with regular meetings with our counterparts in other provinces, territories, and federally, and with colleagues in other jurisdictions. Some folk may remember the Ontario put out a white paper about privacy modernisation a little while back. I think it was a year or so back, and in formulating that, we had quite extensive engagement with colleagues in Europe and the UK and Australia, New Zealand, other places. We probably engage more with folk who are coming from a Westminster tradition of legislation, because that's easier to accommodate. But there's been some really interesting conversations we've had with colleagues in some of the US jurisdictions as well. So yeah, it's an international issue, and one where we are certainly quite happy to learn from experiences of colleagues elsewhere.
Excellent. All right, moving on to our next question there, John. As a province, how do we stand from a privacy policy perspective compared to others? It's an excellent question.
It is. And I think FIPA as a statute that sets out the rules is a bit dated. I'm not going to deny that. It's an older piece of legislation, but I think it's also fairly principled in its approach, so has maintained a level of currency. In terms of practice, though, perhaps rather than legislation, I think we're in a pretty good shape. Some of the things that are very strong in terms of Ontario's level of privacy practice, I think we have a very sophisticated and constructive regulator in our Information Privacy Commissioner, and a very good working relationship with her and her office. We actually have a political level who are genuinely committed, from all my experience, genuinely committed to the privacy expectations and rights of Ontarians. So it's privacy is something that is genuinely valued in terms of decision making. We have some pretty mature practices for ensuring fundamental privacy impact assessments and considerations as technology projects evolve as well. So privacy is embedded as an ongoing lens throughout the development of tools and indeed policies in the Ontario government. So if for anyone who is a complete policy nerd and has read our privacy policies, you'll be aware that the requirements to conduct a privacy impact assessment are not limited to IT projects. They're about any major change initiative. So whether it's a policy change or a process change or a technology change. So from what I'd say, we're in a pretty good shape compared to colleagues. One area where the province has been accused of lagging a little bit is some of the legislative arrangements for non-government activities. We rely on federal law for privacy requirements in terms of commercial activity, and the non-commercial sector in Ontario is not subject to privacy laws. So the completeness of legislative coverage is one area that I know has been raised in a number of settings as a gap in Ontario. But in terms of government practice, we're certainly doing a good job by Ontarians from what I see.
Absolutely. John, there's a question from the audience here talking about, what are some current policy and laws in place that protect the data for citizens of Ontario? Is there any resources that this individual can take a look on some of the policy and regulations?
So one of the best tools for understanding which laws might apply, there's actually a little bit of a flowchart. I think it's on the Federal Privacy Commissioner's website, because as I just mentioned, for certain settings in Ontario, it is federal law that applies. So there's quite a nice little flowchart that helps identify, is it the Federal Privacy Act? Is it the federal is it PIPEDA? Can never remember what PIPEDA stands for. Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. Is it the provincial FIPA? So our provincial FOI law also includes sort of central government privacy requirements. Is it PHIPA, Health Information Statute, that has some separate heightened requirements for protection of privacy in the health information space? Is it our Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act? So there's different range of different statutes that apply. There's some extra colour put on those through corporate policies within the province, and for organisations that are active internationally, then they may also find that they need to comply with either European or other international statutes where they're dealing with, where Ontarians are dealing with organisations in other settings. So it can be quite a complex landscape to navigate in terms of what the regulatory and legislative controls are. One thing, though, that makes that perhaps a little bit less messy in practice is that within Canada, pretty much all of those statutes have the same intellectual origins and are based on the same fundamental principles. In fact, a lot of legislation worldwide goes back to OECD analysis that really was done on global scale and was provided the underlying principles of privacy legislation in many countries through the 1980s. So even though there's a lot of different pieces, when you actually look at the fundamentals, most of them have got a huge amount of common ground. Data minimization, only collecting information where it's necessary, transparency so that people know what's been collected and why, ability to access information held about yourself, prohibitions on using information for other purposes beyond what it was than that for which it was collected, obligations around security. Actually, one of the areas where security is most visible, cybersecurity is most visible in terms of legal obligations, is where it's framed as legal obligations to protect personal information. Because if you're not actually protecting personal data, then are you really respecting privacy? So those kind of common principles are underpinnings of pretty much all of the frameworks across Canada.
And I think we've got time maybe just for two more questions here. One of them is just around if there's anything you can share in terms of best practices, John, in terms of how you ensure that the Ontario Public Service or our organization is ensuring that employees and stakeholders are effectively communicated and understanding our privacy policies and processes.
So this is one of those ones where you can never over communicate. It starts with ensuring that privacy is part of the onboarding process, and I think in most ministries it is. Regular reminders. I think it was last year we tried to work with Julia and the team to make sure that we were taking opportunities around Cybersecurity Awareness Month to again heighten the promotion of privacy practice. There's online training courses that we have that were asked about earlier, and just really embedding privacy expectations in everything that we do. But it's a continuing challenge. Certainly, that whole education and awareness piece is never a once and done. Even if the obligations are not changing, we need to keep pushing it out there. So I think we do a good job, but we could certainly do more, and we're certainly not going to be letting up anytime soon.
Excellent. And then one more question here, and I think just everyone's just very interested in terms of your roles and a day in your life there, John, is how has being a former CISO helped you in your current role today?
It's actually helped a lot. I think going back, I think having been Chief Privacy Officer helped me step in and be CISO for a while because of just how closely related these worlds are. But then having been CISO for a period, I think gave me a heightened insight into some of the ways that privacy risks can manifest in technical ways, and a heightened understanding of just the tools that are available and the opportunities for connecting dots between privacy practice and cybersecurity practice, broader risk management practice. And perhaps the final thing I'll say in this space is the opportunity to work with the amazing team in the cybersecurity division helped me get to know a bunch of folk who I know are really important colleagues in the journey, and things like getting the opportunity to have some airtime on Julia's show to talk about how important privacy is to you all. So the relationships that get built through operating in a slightly different world become incredibly important. Back to my key advice piece, the team game. You actually want to know the other folk who are playing on your team, and having stood in the shoes of the CISO for a while helped me get to know some of the folk who are sharing the line with me, if you like, when it comes to protecting Ontarians' personal data. So it was a great opportunity, and one that has certainly, I think, helped equip me to move forward and take a more better informed and a more expansive view of the tools that are available to support privacy and effective data governance.
Yeah, we can certainly see that the transition there at that time, a few years back now, was quite seamless for you. But at this time here, we'll give John a little bit of a break. There was a ton of questions for you, John, so thanks very much. Today, guys, we talked about the interconnectedness to fundamentals and key principles between cybersecurity and privacy. To wrap things up here, no organization can really ignore the fundamentals of privacy when dealing with customers, to staff, to the public. Privacy is not just a compliance task. It is done because it's what the public expects. And it needs to be clear of what information is being collected and providing reasoning to why to minimize the risk of privacy. We even went on to talk about dispelling some myths today around privacy, and private organizations are not as important than government. Privacy is important for everybody. And it's not just John's job to protect our privacy data. It's really a team sport for everyone to collectively in all of your roles to protect the data. Privacy practice is limited in innovation, while responsibility and privacy really helps create a state of advanced creativity. Hopefully, I summed it up a little bit. I know there was much more to that discussion there, but I hope in terms of the key takeaways here that you have a better understanding of the interconnectedness between cybersecurity and privacy and why it should be a top priority for you in your organization. Again, special thank you to our guest today, John Roberts, for giving his time and advice. It's always my favorite time of the month when I get to go on the Cyber Talk show to speak to all of you. And to those of you, again, thank you for those who have watched and participated. I hope you were able to learn about the importance of privacy, and feel free to share your thoughts on the comments section. And as always, it's important to stay on top of cybersecurity best practices to keep yourself and those around cyber safe. So I do encourage everyone to keep coming back and learning more about cybersecurity with us on the Cyber Talk Show. Stay cyber safe and see you soon, guys.